Afternoon. My name is Patrick Craig. I am the Public Programs Coordinator here at the National Building Museum. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the museum this afternoon, and this program this afternoon, which we're really excited about, Liz Plater-Zyberk. It's great to see so many of you out here on a hot Friday afternoon, so we're really excited about that, so welcome. Before I turn the podium over to Lee from the US EPA, by the way, I got to mention our long-standing partnership. This series we've done for about 11 years now is presented in association with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and the Smart Growth Network, and we're really grateful for that partnership. It brings great programs to folks like today's program, so we're glad for that partnership. But before I turn it over to Lee, who's going to introduce our speaker, I just want to mention a few upcoming programs. Tomorrow, if you haven't had enough of us already, tomorrow morning, Saturday afternoon, at 1 o'clock, we continue our Three Movements in Architecture series with a lecture on modernism. It'll be our own Martin Muller will be doing that lecture. He's great. You've never seen him present. He's going to be talking about all the different facets of modernism. And the great thing about this series is that at the end you have a little handout that points out some buildings in the modernism style in DC, and you can take a self-guided tour, take your friends, your family out in DC and show them what you learned on Saturday. That series also continues on the 25th. It wraps up. That'll be our last one on Art Deco. That's going to be with Dr. Karen Alexis, who is an architectural historian who'll be guiding you through Art Deco. So I encourage you to come out for those. Also on the 21st, we continue our DC Build series with a look at the Purple Line. Probably folks who live around here are familiar with this project. Should be very interesting. We have someone from the Maryland Transit Administration, Michael Madden, and a professor from the University of Maryland, Kelly Clifton, and our own Washington Post, Dr. Gridlock, who'll be moderating that session. And so we're going to be really a good conversation about what the Purple Line is and what the options are and what we're looking at. So it should be very exciting. That's next Tuesday evening here in the Great Hall. So should be encourage you to come out for that. And then lastly, on the 28th, we have our Green Community International Student Design Competition. This was something we put out on our website, and we got over 1,300 entries from students all across the world about their ideas for brownfield redevelopment in their communities. Really exciting. And so we're going to be presenting the winners for that in a lecture. So it should be really interesting. Encourage you to come out for that. As always, all these programs are listed in our calendar as well as on our website, which is www.nbm.org. So with that, I'll turn the podium over to Lee Sobel from the US EPA to introduce Liz. Thank you.
Hi, thanks. It's nice to see so many of you here. I appreciate you coming out today. It's a great program that we've been doing for over 10 years now with the National Building Museum. And today is no less. Of course, we have another great speaker. Before I introduce Liz Plater-Zyberk, just a couple of housekeeping notes. There is no speaker series in August next month, but again, we would like to please ask you to join us as we always do in September, when Robin Chase will be our speaker. Robin is the founder of Zipcar, and she's currently now with Go Loco. So we're looking forward to that. Just by way of introduction, my name is Lee Sobel. I'm with the EPA Smart Growth Program right down the street. And thank you very much for being here. It's my pleasure to introduce Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk. Today I have a personal relationship with her going back to work the two of us collaborated with on the Great Fields to Goldfields work, as well as I was a Knight Fellow in Community Building at the University of Miami, where Liz has been the dean at the School of Architecture there, and she's taught there since 1979. Liz received her undergraduate degree in architecture and urban planning from Princeton University and her master's of architecture from Yale School of Architecture. She is the founder of the Congress for the New Urbanism, and she's also a founding principal of Duany Plater-Zyberk and Company, Town Planners and Architects, DPZ, which I'm sure all of you know. DPZ is a leader in the national movement called New Urbanism, which seeks to end suburban sprawl and urban disinvestment. The firm's award-winning method of integrating master planning with design codes and regulations is being applied in over 200 regions, towns, and cities throughout North America, as well as Europe and Asia. She's co-authored the book Suburban Nation, The Rise of Suburban Sprawl and the Decline of the American Dream, as well as The New Civic Art, a book on the architecture of Duany Plater-Zyberk. With that, it's my pleasure to welcome Liz Plater-Zyberk.
you, Lee. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And this is a presentation which may seem a little bit rocky along the way, but it's really ideas in progress, some projects that are in fact experienced that we can point to for what's ahead, but I would hope that I can get through it quickly enough that we would have some time for discussion and maybe to help some of the parties here who are going to be involved in federal agencies working together like they never have before and providing them some ideas, because you're in the idea stage now. Smart growth, new urbanism, and green building have aligned a set of principles for change in the built environment. These address solutions for the evolving problems of metropolitan growth, energy resource depletion, and climate change. Still, much of the public discourse on these topics, including federal policy, focuses on technological solutions and inventions. Little attention seems to be given to reducing the need for energy use, in particular with regard to land use patterns that generate vehicular dependence and emissions. To policymakers, changing technology appears to be easier than changing behavior or changing the built environment. You might remember that phrase, all land use is local, is a longtime refrain of the federal government, so top-down action on this score will be novel. Nevertheless, there's a positive perspective for urbanism as an energy conservation strategy. This afternoon, I would like to discuss how private investment has already been making the land use changes needed to encourage reduction of vehicular dependence, how the regulatory framework can induce this, showing a series of examples of design and policy that are succeeding in retrofitting suburban sites. And finally, I hope we can conclude with a discussion of how federal policy could play a productive role. Now, I think it's important to comment on thoughts you're probably having. How can there be any hope for any building in the near future when the short-term prospect for demand is bleak? With the growing supply of empty, unaffordable housing, retail and commercial contraction, and institutional caution. While there is too much of anything, it is difficult to imagine remaking any of it. Still, it's encouraging to read reports of this week's White House Urban Affairs Summit, which confirmed that the conceptual division between core city and suburbs no longer needs to exist. The recognition of metropolitan interdependence at the highest level of government, I think, is indeed a victory. How to implement such a new vision, however, remains a challenge. The new administration's stimulus package offered a great hope for a transportation reset. However, the shovel-ready emphasis resulted in routing of funds along conventional lines of practice. And so it was no surprise to read in the New York Times last week the assessment that a majority of the funding will not benefit sprawl abatement. 70% of it has gone to state departments of transportation, who, for reasons of political equitability, tend to spread that benefit throughout the state, prioritizing state roads as well, rather than concentrating it with population need. Only 30% went to metropolitan planning organizations, but we know that that's a misnomer anyway. So this is disappointing, but the upcoming transportation bill, T4, represents another opportunity to try to get it right. As one administration review of the stimulus acknowledged, we may have to change the method of funding to avoid repeating the recent transportation past. This may be true in order to follow CNU's advocacy. The Congress for the New Urbanism has been making a point recently of talking about the need to fund networks, encouraging spending on local road networks rather than highways, to, as John Norquist puts it, to make sure that transportation spending adds value. In other words, that it sets up different places for redevelopment and new private sector investment. And just to illustrate that point a little bit, I would point out to probably a condition that exists in the suburban areas of Washington, just as it does in suburban Pennsylvania, where I grew up, in which the old rural road network remains in place while suburbia expands pod by pod without adequate connectivity for the multiplicity of uses and density which has been inserted. I think you can probably each imagine one of these places that would benefit by a more thorough connectivity, and indeed, if there is to be any sort of densification for transit use and for the remaking of the suburbs, as I will be showing you, then how you fund that additional network becomes a very important part of our immediate federal future. So, on with the slides. Much of this represents the work of my firm, and I think at this point you could take the lights off me and just focus the lights and take all the lights off and just focus the camera on the slides. This represents work that is, of course, collaborative with other firms and other consultants, as well as within the firm. And I'm really using it to illustrate some of the issues and experience that I think offer both lay out what needs to be done as well as provides encouragement that we know what to do with the help of the new urbanism. So this is the beginning of a new book, which Galina Takhcheva in our firm has prepared, and many of the slides are kind of draft slides as this project gets going, because in fact, as we've been thinking about the current economic context, where the new urbanism has been and what might be possible in the near future because of the condition we're in, we have identified that actually retrofitting the suburbs would make a very good focus that could, in fact, spur economic activity again. So I'm grateful to Galina for allowing me to use this work. So what I'm going to do is run through a series of topics, design techniques at various levels of density and various aspects of region, community, building block, and thoroughfare, as well as talk briefly about regulating techniques, and at the end, get to the implementation techniques that hopefully will spur you to add your comments. But of course, the first thing to do is to understand the history of suburban extension of the metropolis. And so a series of slides show you the generations from the first extensions, such as Forest Hills in New York, outside of the city, usually along train lines, to the second generation of suburbs after World War II, which filled in the spaces between the hub and spoke train system as the ring roads and expressways into town made automobile commuting possible. The third generation, which extends ever further out in that rural network in which everything's quite separated and where traffic is often worse than it is further inboard. And I think we've already targeted in our discussion of this part of the metropolis, where more than half the people live, by the way, understanding what the targets, what the places for activity might be. You're not likely to rebuild in any great extent, I don't think, single-family neighborhoods. Maybe the recent foreclosure crisis will make that look a little different. But the single-owner large sites, usually at intersections of commercial intensity, are the opportunities. So starting at the largest scale, because we know there are some counties that are already looking at this scale. I read this morning that Montgomery County has a plan which has been worked on for a while, intending to focus new development in a transit-oriented way. A series of steps that can lead to a large-scale plan of sprawl repair. The first one being, of course, to identify the domain, the area that you're working on. The second, to delineate and repair the conservation picture, which may involve delineating hoped-for additional reserves and preserves, identifying the commercial nodes, which I just mentioned are often at major intersections, looking at the road network to understand what might be logical transit routes, both rail and bus, and looking at those locations for sprawl repair, and finally, additionally, in some cases, projecting the transfer of development rights from the open space that you wish to further conserve in order to bring it to those new nodes of density. And when you put it all together, all of those steps, you have a very rational approach to what makes sense in the long run. There's a lot more to be said about these. I'm sorry the slides are faint, but I just really gave you the summary of it. We first used this technique a number of years ago in Hillsborough County in southwestern Florida, and a series of slides here will show you those steps being put into action. On the left, the development which already had consumed much of the county, suburban sprawl pods of separate uses. On the right, a series of discs in that Peter Calthart manner of showing a community what projected population growth will be, and showing how it might spread out over the county at at the current trends of low density growth. And then taking a look at the open space, what little is preserved and what can be additionally considered for preservation, or at least for reservation, because it's not yet built up, always with great emphasis on continuity, existing drainage, natural drainage, and so on. And then finally, projecting where the densities might be transferred to, those orange circles, and the final drawing, which shows significant green conservation and new neighborhoods and new town centers that might provide the focus for the existing suburban development that's already there. So hopefully you can see how those steps can be taken. There's some interesting new developments at this scale which are ongoing. Elliot Price from Criterion, I believe his office is in Portland, has developed a manner of thinking at a regional scale with a kind of transect from development to different kinds of open space, some of which are long-term reserves to limit the supply of land, some of which are actually conservation areas forever, to be conserved forever. And this is the Mississippi coast, where he first rolled this out in the Mississippi Renewal Charrette after Hurricane Katrina in 2005. In our office at this point, we have taken this kind of work and we've begun to apply these little hexagons are intended to show a more thorough examination of both what exists and might be considered the foundation for reconstruction or redevelopment in the manner that you see this page of analysis. It's given information that's fed into a database that then produces a barcode, and that specific zone can then be, or a series of them can be put together to develop a place type, which is a series of different types of built environments, which can then aggregated actually make an urban place or a city. And so this here, as I'm presenting it to you, is obviously extremely abstract, but as I move through the presentation, I hope you'll begin to understand that actually this kind of ability to manipulate in an abstract fashion might be very useful if we really get into this kind of work in a big way around the country in the future. Another aspect at the regional scale that's very important is the conservation of agricultural land and understanding how to enable that to happen when indeed metropolitan pressures for growth change the value of land so much such that ag becomes difficult. We're actually in an interesting time because that might be shifting. There's a great understanding now that indeed ag land is valuable to have close into the city. Certainly even on a very fundamental level, the First Lady is making a mark with children and urban populations to help us understand the value of this land. But there is still the issue of land value to deal with. And in a study some years ago for our county, the yellow on the left is metropolitan Miami-Dade County, the kind of development that's 6 to the acre and above. And the green area is ag land that is 5 acres to 1 unit. That was an attempted downzoning a number of years ago. It hasn't been able to go beyond that. And there has been a great fear of loss of that land. We are a constricted region in terms of total area that's usable, and this will always be under pressure. GIS, of course, serves in very interesting ways. Those are property size, an analysis of property sizes, ownership size, which can give you some hints about what the expectations of the owners are. But essentially what came out of that study, looking at this one dwelling unit per 5 acres drawn on a square mile, there are really only several strategies. One is that you can change the zoning to induce clustering, therefore reducing infrastructure and maintaining the open space at that density for cultivation. Secondly, you can try to avoid additional development by setting up conservation easements. That's, of course, always a voluntary action. Or develop a way to purchase development rights. Many states, in fact, have legislation for this. It's not funded, and obviously for a while it won't be at the point that we are now. But it's important to have that kind of legislation in place. And something that's much easier to do at the local level, development rights, transfers, severable use rights, it's sometimes called, to have the regulations in place so that when activity starts again, it's possible to take advantage of it. So in the end, if land is valuable, whether it's for conservation or for agriculture, if it starts getting a buildable value, it's very difficult, if it's not already saved in some way, to save it for either of those two uses. And really the only thing you can do is in some way pay for it. It's like historic preservation. Affordable housing may come under this topic, in which the only way you can do it is develop some sort of land trusts and some sort of method of buying down the value so that you can maintain it. Now, at the same time, as I mentioned, there's this great interest in agriculture close to home. Many of us, how many in this room have done any vegetable gardening in the recent past? So more than a third of the room raised its hands. Probably 5 years ago, you might not have done that. And so at DPZ, we've been, as many others have been, we've been looking at this idea of agricultural urbanism. How do you encourage or allow agriculture to take place within the urban boundary, let's say? And so using the transect, this idea of different kinds of environments appropriate for different kinds of density, we've been working on ways to project gardening, which might happen at the farm scale on the far left, to community gardens close into the city, or even terrace gardens at the highest density, as well as backyard gardens in the suburbs and in small towns. So this is easy to imagine. It's just a way of showing that it can happen. And what we always do is develop a series of visual tools to help people to understand these ideas, which sometimes become much more accessible with drawings like this that show yard gardens, kitchen gardens, community gardens, vertical gardens, and so on. There's, in case you haven't noticed, architects have started making drawings that show gardens running up the sides of buildings. I think that's still to be tested. So at the community scale, at a smaller scale, at the neighborhood scale, we have identified the different sprawl types from the rural subdivision through different kinds of commercial centers. Can you read the print in the back? Yes, okay, so I won't go through that. And identified what the community type that could grow out of that is through this sprawl repair process. And you'll see at the bottom it says walkable place types. I'd like to make reference to the fact that while a number of us have been working out what the details are of different densities along the transect, there's another group of people who've been, and one of their great spokesmen is Peter Calthorpe, who have been working on identifying place types when you aggregate urbanism. Is it a hamlet? Is it a village? Is it a core city? And these are eminently integrated ideas, and we're all working on trying to develop this kind of vocabulary and system that is easy to understand and eminently usable. Now, I'm just going to look through some notes and make sure I'm not missing anything. So very quickly, I'm just going to run through some of these place types. This is, I think, a thorough list, but if you're tracking us, you might point out if we're missing anything, because this also is a work in progress. And the slides will show an existing condition, a suburban condition, and then a projected repaired condition. So the kind of rural subdivisions that occur along rural roads could become rural villages, such as you see here. Single-family suburban subdivisions, the least likely to change. However, we're projecting some strategies for that. Multifamily subdivisions, these may be rental apartment complexes, might in the long run be fairly easy to intervene with in terms of their single ownership. Shopping centers, likewise, as single owner or maybe only a few owners can work together to change their prospect. These are the kinds of gray fields that Lee mentioned in the beginning that have been identified across the country. And these exist at several densities or in several types, as shopping centers, as business parks, where most of the area is often parking lots, suburban malls, and of course this kind of work has been ongoing in many parts of the country. The edge cities, where it's really a mix of all of those things, suburban campuses, the kinds of institutional sites that have broad open space, and yes, even underperforming golf courses, which have come through the door at DPZ as well as at other firms. So just a few examples. This is in West Miami-Dade County. Some of you may know the Doral golf course. And this is an office park which largely occupied by the GSA, which is moving out. I should say government offices rented by the GSA. And this is the plan that was produced for the investment company that said it's time to remake this place into something different. Doral had incorporated this part of the suburban county and was receiving a large influx of Venezuelan immigrants. And so the idea of making a fairly high density downtown seemed to make sense on this site. And so what you see is the existing road grid. I'm sorry, it's at a different angle than that photograph was, in which some of the buildings stay the same, but others are indeed scraped. Infrastructure remains, and blocks of lined garages and 10-story buildings, the purple, are shown to aggregated to make an urban space with a small central park for playing fields. There is, for this, in the approvals process, it's already under construction. The approvals process involved a diagram, it's the site plan that you see here, with various symbols that delineate different kinds of frontages. Essentially, every frontage has to be either a townhouse, a live-work, or a retail unit. So the liners have that choice, and then the high-rises can be either offices or residential. And that's what this diagram shows, and the design guidelines that lead you through this this kind of a strategy were really only 8 pages. So this is a kind of light transformation with very light documentation, and is fairly demanding on the city planning office to make sure that what follows will be done according to this plan. Of course, one of the first suburban retrofits was Mashpee Commons, a shopping center in Cape Cod, which began its life as a strip center in 1965. In the early 80s, began a transformation with all of the tenants in place. And what you see is an 88 slide. I should have a more recent one, which shows a street grid being laid not only over the shopping center already, but making connections to the surrounding areas around this intersection. That's one of the critical aspects of this project that I'd like to speak about. So the little red line in the middle shows you where the shopping center was to begin with. The photograph was taken from that traffic circle. But what you can see from this plan is not only the walkable connections within the owner's property in the lower left-hand corner, but also the connections across the county roads, those rural roads that I mentioned before, which are being made into neighboring properties. And this is one of the areas where probably infrastructure funding would be very useful because if it does not receive any other assistance, it has to be done by the developers entirely. And it won't be done by a county or a township government, for instance, because they don't have the funds for this. And I would suggest that instead of widening those roads coming into the traffic circle where there's already a certain amount of congestion, that if you actually set up another circular connection, a grid, in other words, of connectivity around this node of mobility, that the money would be better spent. It wouldn't just be widening a road for people who already exist, but it would be setting up the land value for future development. I hope that's clear. So Mashpee's been in place with great success for a long time. Many of the original tenants remained. And after a moratorium on housing in Cape Cod for many years, it's building the first housing on the edges. And that was a single owner. Another single owner property here in Utah shows a large mall surrounded by parking in a small village, again recently incorporated just south of Salt Lake City, in which, again, the mall disappears. One of the big boxes stays. And what you might see along the left-hand side of it, where the red line is, that there's a line of green trees, and that was a channelized creek. They called it a river, which this project offered the opportunity to restore and have a beneficial effect on a larger environmental issue. This was one of the charrette drawings, which just shows how it's developed with a street grid, a central plaza, and different densities of housing, and overlooking that creek with a small park on the southern side. With one of the renderings that shows that the street grid which could have been anything. That plan is a brand new plan. There was no infrastructure, essentially, to deal with. Set up its focus to engage the surrounding mountains, and in particular, several peaks that people enjoyed looking at. So this focus, this drawing terminating in the central plaza, is also looking at the mountain range behind. And this slide shows the density. Generally speaking, townhouses and 5-story buildings, in some cases retail below, and the opportunity to have taken that channelized stream, daylighted it, given it a more natural setting, and indeed even a small park at one end of it. Now, as an architect, I would add that while these kinds of projects offer great opportunities, we have found that the 5-story or more building that hides a parking garage is indeed one of the hardest building types to design well. To make it an interesting building that people, that gives pleasure, that people think is beautiful, that somehow deals with the scale of the pedestrian in the way that these drawings show is, in fact, in the course of implementation, not very easy. Yet another one, this at the scale of a regional mall and its surroundings, is a project we worked on with Dover Coal in our own Dade County. And here you see the landscaping mall in the middle, but there, and the confluence of highways and rail, which make this a likely urban center. And one of the important things to understand is the regulatory framework at the state level helped make this possible. This has multiple property owners. All the projects I've shown you up to now were single property owners. That's not that hard, although it's not easy. But many property owners coming together, in fact, is a difficult management issue. And the county's comprehensive plan, which was filed with the state, had been asked to identify urban centers at nodes of transportation. And since there are both highways and transit, which are landing at this, in this triangular area, this was very clearly an urban center. And whenever anybody got cold feet about doing this project along the way, we would say, yes, but the comprehensive plan and the state will make us do it. And so sometimes that higher level of authority can be very helpful. It was, of course, a public process, and I'll get to this once again before the end of the talk. What was significant in downtown Kendall, I think, as part of this experience is that it was initiated by a Chamber of Commerce, a non-for-profit. It was Chamber South, and at a time when there was great suspicion of the government several government initiatives going on, and private developers were having a particularly hard time from NIMBYs. A process that was managed by the Chamber of Commerce, in fact, brought this project to fruition and to approval with the county commission, in which every commissioner could vote for it, because by the time it got there, nobody was against it. And I should say that Dover Coal, Victor Dover, managed the charrette process extremely well in that one. But part of it was understanding that this, again, a very large-scale street grid had to change, and showing the public various scale comparisons of other places that they like to walk in. There was a kind of consensus that Savannah, particularly because of its open spaces, and in this case there would be no big piece of land that could be set aside for open space or parks, offered an interesting model. And so the before and after, the existing condition on the left and a rendering of a site plan on the right, shows indeed a bunch of tiny little parks, indeed at the scale of Savannah, that were taking the old code requirement for open space, usually frittered around the edges of a suburban commercial site as part of the setback, aggregated to become these parks that are focal for smaller areas. And here they are, although the county planning department didn't want any drawings in their code book, just words, please, no drawings. They did agree finally to a few schematics like this one, in which those greens were very carefully placed so that no single property owner, this area was small enough that we could actually study each piece of property, no single property owner had to give up more land than anybody else for one of these greens. This is truly an artful process. Once it was agreed that this was a good plan, the process reconvened to set up a form-based code, which is about 25-page insert into the Dade County Code applying to just this particular area, very specific about how buildings front the street, where there are arcades, where parking garages must be lined and where they do not have to be, and so on. This was one of the renderings, and this is some of the build-out. And it's full of warts. There are all sorts of imperfections that I will not point out to you as we go through, but there are several different densities which conformed to the old comprehensive plan, which had a very simplistic step-down of densities. But it, in fact, helped us to complete the project. So it's under construction. It's not the greatest architecture in the world, but it does have people living next to the train station at a higher density. Now, at the smaller scale, building and block, those of you who are familiar with the charter for the new urbanism will see that I've just taken you through the 3 levels of the charter. This Sprawl repair document that Galina's been preparing actually does illustrate how you might work at every scale of building, including a single-family house, which I've said is probably unlikely, but giving guidance for how to densify a single-family house site. An interesting, more recent idea, how to make a McMansion into an apartment building. How drive-throughs might remain behind new liners. How a big box might be transformed. There's been a fair amount of big box shopping centers that have been remade into walkable places, but without mixing uses. Still a possibility for the future. And there are actually many more of those. I'm not going to take you through them exhaustively. I'm trying to give you an idea of how all this works. And then, of course, the thoroughfares. This network needs to be refined so that there are more connections, and even the types of streets need to be reconsidered for multiple mobility. There's an awful lot of suburban roads that have no ability to walk or bicycle or use any other kind of vehicle on them. They're just for automobiles, and so there's a thorough catalog of how to remake the street sections. The regulatory techniques I've already been speaking about, form-based codes, from the design guidelines that might be site-specific to actual municipal codes that are put into place. The SMART code, which many of you may be familiar with, has been developing a series of modules that deal with including issues like affordable housing, has a sprawl repair module underway, regulating plans, regulations, and so on. So the SMART code is, for those of you who don't know, a very thorough code that takes you from a regional plan to the detail of building a block and street with this framework of densities as having appropriate environments for different kinds of density. And that's a whole other lecture to explain to you what the details of the transect, but in outline form, I hope that gives you an idea of why attaching this kind of module to it might be useful. And so a few illustrations from that, which shows this transect from lower density to higher density, in this slide, pointing out what the corollary suburban and urban environments might be in terms of density and detailing, how you can make a shopping center into a town center, and so on. And that, of course, has a lot to do with what's surrounding it. You most likely would not take a strip center and make it into a core urban high-density area because surrounding it is probably just a lot of single-family houses. But you might make it into a small town center that could still serve the surrounding single-family houses while it densifies its own site. So some more of the technical drawings which point out that progression. And these place types then have very specific instructions that, in fact, this is almost like a manual that tells you what you can do and what some of the implementation issues might be. For instance, in the shopping center at the top, that you would be introducing new building types and uses. You need to connect the thoroughfares. You need to retrofit the parking by adding garages and so on. And these are some of the pages that show you the things that I've already showed you. Now, one of the efforts that we've been involved with has been transforming a Euclidean code for the city of Miami into a form-based code through Miami 21. And it really is trying to make a suburban city that's linear and corridor-oriented into one that's nodal and transit-oriented. Some of the educational work that we did was to show the transect as it appears in other cities. That's Washington at the top, T3, T4, T5, and T6, as well as how it already exists in various pieces of the city in order to understand that this is not a kind of starting from scratch with an existing city, but as I put it, it's taking an adolescent to finishing school. And these are some of the code pages. There's so many different kinds of high-rise zoning in Miami that we had to develop subsets of T6, the core city type. Concerns about neighborhood relations, if you can't do the full transition across multiple sites or across some geography, how you might do it in buildings. And so even the actual document deals with all of the smart code issues. And then, of course, while many people are not interested in those kinds of technical issues, they are interested in saying, how will you get us from this existing condition, which is such a bad interface between a high-rise corridor and a low-rise neighborhood? How will this code get us there? And so these are the kinds of illustrations that are used to talk with the public. We have even written a draft for legislation for a state to devote itself to sprawl repair. One of the interesting things in here is that we're identifying parking garages as much as networks as an important part of private investment to support with public funds, because you can't start remaking those shopping centers and malls without putting some of that, taking some of that land bank that's a gray field now and putting that parking into a garage while the transformation is occurring. And the private developer is not going to do that if they're currently parking on the ground. So it may seem counterintuitive, but actually supporting parking garages is important. Now, climate change plays a big role in this because there are many parts of the country that are looking at what they can do about climate change. There are specific cities that are developing policies. I'm on a committee in Miami-Dade County. And if you've given this any thought, you know that there are essentially two things that you can do for climate change. One is to try to mitigate the effects we're having now. And secondly, in some cases, such as South Florida, where sea level rise is expected, you have to start thinking about adaptation as well. And again, in both cases, urbanism becomes part of the solution. And so this is not intended to speak about this at any length, but just to point out that we are working on a kind of system of thinking about this rationally. What are the issues in mitigation? This is the beginning of a decision tree in which we identify who can do what at what level, private sector, public sector, and so on. And likewise, in terms of adaptation actions, what do you have to do? And believe it or not, you begin to understand that the built environment in both cases plays a very important role, and by beginning to identify places and building types typologically in the way that I've shown you through sprawl repair, you can begin to address very specific lines of actions and responsibility. So, but to make change, I think it's important to understand whether it's for any of the major goals. There are really three levels of activity. And this is something I became aware of working on this climate change picture. Well, the first is social marketing. You have to get people to understand where they want to be going and to make it actually appealing. 5 years ago, we probably thought that going out into the garden and growing our own vegetables may not have been too appealing, but all of a sudden it's appealing. A lot of people are doing it, and we've crossed that bridge. Likewise, Seaside was the first new traditional town which made it glamorous or in some way appealing to think of living in a higher density than on a suburban lot. Then there's facilitation, because once you've established the goal and everybody's for it, you begin to find out there are things in the way, usually regulations. There were no zoning codes. In fact, zoning codes were the impediments to building seasides in other parts of the country. So we invented the T&D, the traditional neighborhood district, which began to be inserted into zoning codes around the country to facilitate, or at least to remove the impediments. And finally, regulation, in which you can begin to say, we must do this. And so the SMART code, for instance, which covers a county or a city, is that third step where people have gotten used to the idea that this is the right way to grow, and we want everybody to do this. It's not going to be optional anymore. So my last two slides, I think it's important to understand as we go through this, the processes of remaking and improvement, who's responsible for what? What can we expect the public sector to do? What can you expect the private sector to do? And where does the non-for-profit, where do the non-for-profit groups come in? The Trust for Public Land has been very effective, for instance, in making parks plans and certain kinds of plans in various regions of the country where they represent that neutral force. The Chamber of Commerce in downtown Kendall was a good example of an enabler. And so convening and prodding is very important. And notice under public sector, I've got thoroughfares because that's going to be very important in our near future. But what I hope that we could talk about a little bit more is how this picture from federal to local, because the last slide was about local implementation, this new partnership between DOT, EPA, HUD, maybe it should include ag and some other departments, who knows. This is really a very stimulating time to consider how things might change given the new window that's been opened for partnership. And it could have a tremendous effect because, of course, probably the biggest effect that the federal government has is through funding. Legislation, I think, could be part of that, and that's something that I'm less experienced at. But certainly I've already talked about how the state can provide a cover or at least some framework for the remaking that must happen at local levels, because in the end it has to happen in local communities. And the good news is that we do have the methods and the techniques, and what we really need to work on are the political channels and the funding. So thank you very much for listening and for giving me this opportunity to run these ideas by you, and I would love to hear your comments. Any improvements on this presentation would be useful from you, but also any kind of comments that might help people in the room who are working on these new challenges. Thank you.
Hi,
I do have the microphone, so if you'd like to ask a question or come over, you also just a little warning or notice. Everything is recorded. It will be online at the National Building Museum site for others to listen in on the session. So I'm going to make my way over to you. Start some questions. Also, I want to not let go of the microphone and learn that at the National Suburban Institute, because otherwise we won't get it back.
You said that 5 buildings were problematic architecturally. Well, I'm puzzled by that because most of the great cities in the world are built with 5-story buildings. I mean, Rome and Paris come to mind. What's the problem?
The problem is that they are large in horizontal extension because they're usually hiding a parking garage, which has to be of a certain minimum size. And at some point, they take up the whole length of the block. So the kind of variety that makes our urban places interesting with multiple buildings. If you think about Washington, the streets where several buildings line a block and the streets where it's one building line a block, no matter how good it is. But usually somehow those bigger buildings are less satisfying.
There's the Rue de Lochin project that Leon worked on in Brussels.
Yes, he's mentioning the Rue de Lochin project in Brussels, and there are good examples. But if you look at some of the large-scale places that have been made recently, you'll find them to be less satisfying. So there are good examples. You're right.
I'm involved in a project here in the outskirts of Washington, Leesburg, Virginia, where there's an established historic district. We have gone through the master planning. We have the form-based zoning code in place for about 200 acres of true retrofit. It's the super blocks of 60s shopping centers and industrial sites. But it's getting to the next step, the implementation, particularly where we're in competition with an edge, new urbanist development on the edge of town, which is a nice project, but that's sort of, I guess, the next step. That how do you get to that implementation with all the infrastructure costs and the difficulties of multiple parcels with multiple owners? If you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I think the infrastructure costs are probably the critical issue, because if in an existing place, and we've seen this happening in downtowns and more urban places, when the public sector makes the first commitment to the infrastructure, and perhaps it needs to be through something like a CRA, a redevelopment authority, which can make a TIF district. And this is where perhaps we need to be thinking about new methods, because as I started out saying, some of the old methods which channel funds a certain way require slum and blight when you don't have it, things like that, may need to be reviewed, because the goal is now not necessarily to remake destroyed places, but to remake places for positive reasons of climate change, support of public transit, and so on. So that's not an answer for your situation, but I think yours is a lesson for what we need to pay attention to in terms of funding, both at national and state levels. You've exactly elucidated the issue, because if you had supported infrastructure, for instance, if you had somebody paying for the parking garages that are going in, or even the water main improvements that need to be done, you would immediately be ahead of the Greenfield, which also is putting in their own infrastructure, although it's an easier infrastructure.
Thank you for your presentation. I was wondering, stepping to the bit larger picture from what this gentleman was asking about, the problems of infrastructure, I'm wondering if you could go into a bit why your firm is focusing on suburban repair rather than the urban repair. Is it just that so many ideas have already been developed about urban development, and you see this as just another frontier, but with all these, especially the infrastructure problems with suburban repair, why is your firm focusing on that?
No, that's a good question. We're not leaving behind the urban areas, but the urban areas do have an infrastructure that can be infilled in many areas. It doesn't mean it's perfect, that it doesn't need help. Providence, Rhode Island, for instance, is a great example of a city that has been reworking its interior. It moved a whole section of I-95 in order to benefit the city's revival. And if you can get up there anytime during the summer and see how active it is in various ways, it's probably one of the premier arts cities in the country in terms of the place that young people want to go to be artists. And that has a lot to do with the kind of public life that takes place in the city. But so that's still an important arena, certainly. But when you start talking about the whole picture of the metropolis, which we've just crossed that threshold with the federal government acknowledging, that it's not about the poor people in the city and the suburbs don't need any help. It's really one big picture. Then I think the area that needs some focus, which we're, as you said, giving it, is that large outer belt of the metropolis, which uses the most energy, has the most people in it, and is really the least ready for climate change, energy prices, and being green. So it's just a matter of bringing attention to it.
Hi, good afternoon. How far are you going in linking specific forms or styles of transportation with your place types?
Not far enough. But I think that the thoroughfare part of it speaks to the old or the existing categorization of roads as inadequate to this kind of picture of densification and adding both foot traffic, bicycles, and transit. So I do believe somebody's working on a smart code transportation module. And you're right, that would be a very good thing to connect to it. That really does have a kind of regional picture, which is in some ways more fixed than what the land uses are, especially if there's been a lot of investment. So it may be that you have to do that with planning activity, to really identify what's there.
And this will be our last question for the afternoon.
In Florida in particular, property rates are a huge issue in terms of making changes in suburban areas. I used to work as an urban planner in Tallahassee, which was a wonderfully frustrating experience. And one of the reasons is that property rights really tend to drive the debate. And I understand that education is a big part of that, but in Florida also there's legislation against downzoning. So I was wondering, for your perspective on both sort of national trends, but also in Florida, how to overcome the issue of property rights and to be more frank, whether without protecting conservation areas by repealing the Burt-Harris Act in Florida, you will ever actually be able to promote urban and retrofitting projects.
Burt-Harris is the legal underpinnings for what you just described, in which if you take away any rights, you are supposed to be compensated for them. Remember I said in the beginning, sometimes you have to buy your way out of a situation. However, as I understand it, because we examined it for Miami 21, no one has successfully carried out a lawsuit following that act. And so, and the way it's written is that the value has to be depleted. I'm probably not using the right words. But in fact, one of the things that I attempted to show was that you could avoid the most difficult issues, which are the single-family neighborhoods, where people have their own, their largest investment. And although I showed a single-family retrofit, most of the plans that I was referring to were saying we're retrofitting a single-owner property or a commercial node that would benefit from upzoning. And so more often than not, the process involves upzoning. If you add streets, if there's a public investment in streets and roads, you're even adding more value to the private property. So we are very careful to say that DPZ's work or any of the work that any firms have done in this mode have never reduced anybody's property value. And by now there's enough examples that we can say that with confidence. And so that monster is mitigated largely. Doesn't mean that they're not there and that people aren't worried about that. But the other thing that's going on in Florida, which may be reflective of other parts of the country, is that there really is polarization between the developers and the residents in the following, as demonstrated in the following way. There has recently been passed at the state level a reduction in the growth management laws, which have enabled some of what I described today. And so you don't have to go through some of the state permitting processes anymore as of recently. And of course, that was put through by a group of builders and developers on the one hand. On the other hand, there's a group of citizens, residents, who have enough signatures that we are likely to see on the next ballot. I think it's called Hometown Democracy, in which we will be asked to vote on whether every single land use change to occur in any community will require a vote, an election, which represents the individual residents' perturbation about the way things have been developing. So one of the key issues is how you bring that picture together. And I think that this is where we need some good non-for-profit work to bring people back together.
I'd like to thank everybody for coming out once again. Just a reminder, there's no speaker series next month. September is Robin Chase from Zipcar and Go Loco. Big round of applause again one more time for Sprawl Duany Plater-Zyberk out again. Thank you very much.